It is Friday, January 27th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone. As per usual, let's start off with our PlayStation Plus reminder. The January PS Plus Essential Games are still live, and this is technically your last call for these games, but that's just because it kind of worked out in a way where the first Tuesday of February is not until the 7th, and we won't find out what the lineup is until the 1st, although the games do normally leak every time, so we should find out fairly soon, but you've actually got more than a week left to grab these games, but just make sure you get that done. But for our first story, let's talk about a previous PS Plus premium release, which is Super Stardust Delta, and of course you can buy it separately outside of the subscription, but this game recently got patched for trophies, which is super cool because I know a lot of people looked at this and they thought, whoa, that's so weird, like we actually got a game patched for trophies. Conceivably there's no reason why that couldn't happen, but of course when a game comes out without trophies, you just kind of think, okay, so they're not going to go back and, or they didn't feel the need to add them at that time, and I argued like it's okay to not have these, for these classic games to not have them, that way there's no barrier of entry to getting more classics on the service. With that said, it is highly unusual because we've not had something like this since the, PlayStation 3 days where, pre-2008, that's where the mandate was put in place for, if you're a developer and you're shipping a game on PS3 and, now PS4, 5, even Vita at the time, if you were shipping a game, whether it's free-to-play, premium, digital, physical, it doesn't matter, it has to have trophies. With some few, very few exceptions here and there, but we had early lifecycle PS3 games get patched for trophies, and that's why we have not seen something like this since then. So, very cool. I wouldn't bank on this happening, often, but at least with, Super Stardust, I'm happy with this one. And it's also an extremely easy list because of the rewind. If you don't use rewind, then it might give you a problem because if you're not good with twin stick shooters, this list is like the same from Super Stardust HD, which that gave people a problem when they're, if you're not good at the game, then it can usually be a pain, but it's very simple if you abuse the save state and rewind. But anyway, that was certainly worth pointing out. Maybe they'll do more. It'd be nice to see that, especially given that this is a first-party title. So we do have some first-party games on there that don't have trophies yet. Moving on to our next story, the DualSense Edge is finally available, and something where I will try and have a review up in about 1 or 2 days. I'll try. It's something where, Sony still does not send in product early, which is totally fine, but that's why normally my reviews are a bit delayed compared to others. But what we can say right now is that based on initial testing and what everyone else is saying, it seems like battery life, not very good at all, especially when Sony initially kind of tried to cushion the blow by saying it was moderately shorter or something like that, but it's about 4 to 6 hours on average, really closer to 4 hours, which the reason for that is, we can see during teardowns that the DualSense Edge has a smaller battery capacity. So it has a 1015 milliamp hour battery versus a regular DualSense, which is 1560. So that explains it. And something where one could argue that a smaller battery doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have a smaller overall playtime because you can make efficiencies elsewhere, but we can see that's not the case. It's clearly a lot smaller. That and more things are just drawing power off of it. But also another argument where this is the kind of controller, because some still are kind of missing this, which is, you don't have to buy this thing, right? It's meant to speak to a very particular audience, the kind that would really want to improve their gameplay to, trying to lower your reaction time as much as you can, lower latency. You really want this thing for PvP. I mean, it's all about that, right? And so normally that also means you're going to prioritize, having this thing hardwired the entire time, right? You might not really choose to play wireless, but if you want the sort of modern conveniences of the controller, if you like the premium feel, if you want the stick modules being able to swap those out, right, but you want the convenience of it being wireless, then that is where you're going to be in a rock and a hard place, because 4 hours definitely would be a bit intrusive if you're not always taking, breaks and charging in between. You're certainly going to hit that wall every so often with this thing, which is a bit unfortunate, but we'll talk more about it in the separate video where it's going to be a full unboxing, testing, review, all that stuff. I'll try and get that up in the next day or two. Now, something else that didn't pan out well, which, not to say the DualSense Edge is bad per se, but just trying to segue here into a somewhat relatable topic. So something else that didn't pan out nearly as well is Forspoken, which we talked about that last week. I'd said I feel like the Metacritic's going to be around 60, 70. It just seems like that's where it's going to sit. Yeah, that's what happened. Right now it's at a 67 on Metacritic across 72 different reviews, which, puts it in line as a kind of a mediocre experience. Well, it depends on how you take scores nowadays. Some think that, below 85 is just awful. I feel like you have to explore the scale a bit, so 67 to me means certainly it has a number of issues that may put a lot of people off, but there's still something there for others that they may enjoy the experience. Still something where I encourage you to play the demo if you haven't just yet, whether it's the dialogue that kind of gets in the way, and that is something where I think it highly depends on how you take it. It's got its cringy moments, but you could also just go through it just fine and be like, oh, okay, I'm fine with that's how people talk, right? It's not nearly as, I think, out of position as some frame it to be. But having said that, you could have a problem with the dialogue, the story, the sort of empty open world. But, when it comes to gameplay, it seems like there's enough there. There's some good traversal going on. So there's merits to playing it. But, this was a pretty high-profile game that it doesn't seem to be resonating all that well, which we kind of saw coming. But something else a bit more exciting is Spider-Man 2. And we are also in the same release year, meaning that we should be hearing more news about the game fairly soon. Probably still going to be a few months until we get something significant like a new trailer, but for the time being, we have the voice actor Yuri Lowenthal speaking with comicbookmovie.com, talking about his role in Legion of Superheroes, but he was asked about Spider-Man 2, and so he gave this response where he says, and I quote, I've still got a little bit to do. It's a massive game, so I'm still doing a little bit of work. I know they're confident about the release date, and Insomniac has always been good about that. Obviously, I can't really talk about the game much, but I will tell you that it's astonishing. I'm so excited for you to play it. They know they've got big shoes to fill from the last 2 games, and they've done it. I just can't wait for people to play it. Now, there's not really a whole lot we can pull from that, if only because, and not to downplay Yuri's answer, but it's the standard PR answer of product X, Y, and Z that I'm working on is so great, and I can't wait for you all to play it, experience it, see it, this, that, and the other. So we're always going to see that, but it is interesting to hear him say that Insomniac is feeling good about they're feeling confident that they're going to release the game when they're planning to. As of right now, we only have a release window, which is fall of this year. And we saw this with Ragnarok where the game was initially delayed by a year, but that's something where, once it had a confirmed release window, even a confirmed release date, there was certainly a bit of weird anxiety going around of people thinking that the game was going to get delayed into 2023, which was certainly, I guess, possible to some degree, or at least that would have been rational thinking. It's just more a matter of, because of how Sony has been approaching this lately with all their games during the PS5 cycle, where they don't quite ramp up the marketing cycle until right before the game's about to come out, so like one and a half, 2 months before. I get it if we're like 3 months out and we still haven't seen more about the game, but give it time. I think it's going to be still a few months until we see like a proper new trailer for Spider-Man 2, but I think it's at least encouraging to hear that Insomniac does feel good about their current target. Next up, we have some fairly brief news for Guerrilla Games, where we've got more and more evidence of them just being or going all in on the Horizon universe, which we sort of already knew, but this was recently confirmed on Twitter, where the UK-based code development studio Gobo, they recently sent out this tweet where they say, and I quote here, "We're thrilled to share that Studio Gobo is now a Guerrilla code development partner on the Horizon universe." So, like I said, they're a code development studio. They don't make their own games, but they've worked with a very large client list of well-known publishers in the AAA space. So they've worked with Bethesda, Arcane, Avalanche, I think also Lucasfilm is on there, Hasbro. They're also currently working on Hogwarts Legacy, or I assume their time on that game is done. But the point is, that's primarily what they do, and now they're working on Horizon, which, at this point we can sort of, again, run through the list here. Officially we know about the Burning Shores DLC, that's internally at Guerrilla. There's code development with Firesprite on Called Mountain. There's also the Horizon multiplayer project, that's internal. And then the two rumors is the mobile, like NCSoft MMO game or whatever else. And then there's also possibly a Horizon, a Horizon Zero Dawn PS4, PS5 remaster, I should say, which, that's still a point of contention for some. But, it's like I said before, I can't see them greenlighting a Zero Dawn remaster on PS5 unless it's, not going to be a massive resource hog, and this could be one avenue for them, right? I mean, I can see this being another sort of code development thing where, they're just handing off or at least offloading a lot of that work to, say, Studio Gobo. Perhaps they were always working with Guerrilla for a bit, and now it's finally confirmed. But we saw Guerrilla had job listings opened for trying to oversee a lot of these external studios, which, that's commonplace anyway. There's always a lot of outsourcing in the AAA space, but this makes sense. It's I think, par for the course, but just in totality, we can see that they're doing a lot for Horizon, and now Studio Gobo is going to be helping accomplish that. Now, getting into some PlayStation VR2 news, we have a small adjustment to the launch lineup and also the launch window lineup, which would be Dark Picture Switchback VR. That game is no longer day one. It's been delayed to March 16th, which is unfortunate, but, it's still in that launch window. But on the flip side, we do have a new game that was announced. That's Townsman VR, which is a medieval city builder, and that's now coming on launch day, February 22nd. So kind of a switch there, if you will, but that game does have a physical release, or it's going to get one, so thought that was also worth mentioning, because so far with PSVR 2, the physical releases are very far and few between, but that will have a disc print, but also noteworthy for Switchback VR, because technically that is one of two games on PSVR 2 which are considered brand new, like from the ground up, exclusive PSVR 2 games. The rest are ports from PSVR 1 or MetaQuest and this and that, which I've said before, I think it's less important this time around, but still the launch window is looking extremely packed. Now, on a very related note, we can move on to our next story, which is about PSVR 1 devs and the process of porting their games over to PSVR 2. What it was like, the business implications, things like that. Always good to hear right from developers, and so this was a piece ran on GamesIndustry.biz where they spoke with a few PSVR 2 developers. And so, for example, we heard from Josh Stixma, the design director on Moss. He had this to say, and I quote here, "The obvious big one that comes into play is, now it's a game that involves two hand tracking controllers rather than a single DualShock. Fundamentally, the input needs to change in order to handle that." Now, situations are of course going to vary between developers, so in the case of Moss, where the game is primarily using a DualShock 4 light bar, they had to readjust that to two PSVR 2 Sense controllers. Polyarch's publishing director Lincoln Davis also discussed the decision of not offering a free upgrade, where they say, and I quote, "We had to go back and really dig deep into the game design itself to really optimize for the platform, from haptic feedback, increased graphics, field of view, eye tracking to controller setup, really fundamentally changing the experience to be better and more immersive. We're a small team working on this, and if we want to keep creating worlds like this, we can't just give stuff away for free." 17-Bit CEO and creative director Jake Kasdale had this to say about their game, Song in the Smoke, where they say, and I quote here, "I think the team was pretty proud of the original, even with the limitations in front of us, but it's just so much better with a dual stick setup. It's a totally different game." Now, Enhanced Games producer Mark McDonald had mentioned because PSVR 2 isn't backwards compatible, it was actually a good excuse to go back and make the best versions of their games. He says, "We're really excited because superficial things like resolution and frame rate really matter in games like Tetris Effect Connected and Res Infinite, where sound and visual sync and the crispness of it are extremely important and a big part of the experience." So I think it's mostly well known at this point that PSVR 2 versions of these games are going to look very good, right? I mean, there's going to be a number of enhancements that really take it to another level, and that's kind of what I was getting at before, where exclusivity doesn't matter nearly as much. If you've never played these games, despite where they were before, I mean, you can play the best version of them, or one of the best versions of them on PSVR 2. But for developers, it really depends on where you're coming from, right? So we had heard before that Sony was trying to make it a very easy process coming from, say, MetaQuest. And when you've got principally, a similar input method, that is going to make that a lot more straightforward and approachable. PSVR 1, we went through the whole thing about why it's not backwards compatible. It's just, the input methods are so different that I'm sure that library, even when they start running tests, which they did in the background to some degree, you've just got a lot of games that are broken because of how they were made on PSVR 1. There's a lot of different ways you can approach PSVR 1 games with the DualShock 4 light bar or move controllers or additional accessories with the aim controller. And so you've got all these edge cases about how their UI elements worked, how the gameplay worked, how their locomotion worked. And a lot of that stuff is not going to be easily transferable to PSVR2. And that also means when you're, say, porting a game, same deal, right? Even if you want to do a native PSVR2 version, you're going to have some hurdles based on how that game was made on PSVR1. So Polyarc is a good example, and it really shows why they are charging for the game again on PSVR2. They feel that, they had to go back and do enough to where they don't think it's financially advantageous to, or rather it's an opportunity cost, I guess, to not sell it again, right? And some devs might not feel that's appropriate given that it was maybe a bit easier to get the game on PSVR2. But still always, really good to hear directly from developers on what the process is like. Moving on to more The Last of Us HBO craziness. So episode 2 was last week. Episode 3 coming up this weekend, and it should be a very big one. But episode 2 did very good. So according to viewership tracking by Nielsen, which comes directly from Warner Bros. Discovery, episode 2 debuted at 5.7 million viewers, which represents a 22% jump from episode 1's debut, and that apparently is HBO's largest week 2 audience growth for an HBO original drama series in the history of the network. And unsurprisingly, this has indeed had an effect on game sales. So for the week ending January 21st, based on physical boxed copies sold in the UK tracked by the GfK, The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Remastered saw a massive 238 and 322% jump in sales, respectively. Now, that's just a percentage difference from their outgoing position in terms of the actual sales chart for that week. They only got up to number 20 for Part 1 and number 22, or number 32 for Remastered. But it's such a seismic jump that they saw. And I do feel it's worth mentioning again because it's certainly something that's been said, but we almost did not get that Part 1 remake. It wasn't because of the HBO series, at least from what we have heard and the history behind that game. There is some kind of alternate timeline out there where instead we got an Uncharted 1 remake, which that would have then coincided with the Uncharted movie, and that would have been it would have been appropriate to a degree, although, the Uncharted movie is not quite a one-to-one remake like The Last of Us is, but still worth mentioning that the Part 1 remake almost didn't happen, but we saw, Remastered also is climbing up the sales chart, and I presume that once the show continues, these games will hold on the charts quite well, especially because, people are primarily buying games digitally anyway, and I'm sure a lot of folks are checking out the games there where it's a lot more accessible instead of, say, ordering them from a retailer. But with, more The Last of Us interest climbing over time, we're still going to keep seeing that speculation and theories and, looking at Naughty Dog and asking, okay, but what about a Last of Us Part 3? Recently, Neil Druckmann was speaking with BuzzFeed, and this is where he provided a very lengthy quote on that possibility, and he says, "I know there's a bunch of people wondering about The Last of Us Part 3 and whether that will be a thing or not. All I could say is at Naughty Dog, we're very, very privileged that our publisher is Sony, which means Sony funds our games, supports us, and we're owned by Sony. They have supported us every step of the way to follow our passions, meaning that just because something is successful, people think there's all this pressure and we have to make a sequel. That's not the case. For us, Uncharted was insanely successful. Uncharted 4 was one of our best-selling games, and we're able to put our final brushstroke on that story and say that we're done. We're moving on. Likewise, with The Last of Us, it's up to us whether we want to continue the story or not. Our process is the same thing we did when we did Part 2, which is if we can come up with a compelling story that has this universal message and statement about love, just like the first and second game did, then we will tell that story. If we can't come up with something, we have a very strong ending with Part 2, and that will be the end." That is a surprisingly long and thorough answer for basically something that you would think would be the Yuri Lowenthal answer from before, right? Like, there's just so many things where you're going to get a PR boilerplate answer that doesn't really give us any sort of direction as to what they're up to or what they're doing, and some might infer that that's them trying to pull away from Part 3, saying that we may very well do something else. But I think he's just kind of reiterating what we've heard before about Sony and their first-party studios, which is that they are offered certain liberties that I think many other big publishers are a bit more, not nearly as lenient on. So not to say that Sony doesn't, shut down studios, which they certainly have, or that they cancel projects, or that they turn down pitches. those things all happen, and I'm sure there's a certain side of, working under Sony's ownership that can be a bit tedious and annoying, or perhaps even ugly. But time and time again, we do hear that there's these creative freedoms that these teams are afforded, and at the very least, they can explore ideas at their own pace, and if they don't want to work on a franchise that they've done for a very long time, they might not get nearly as much pressure to continue that franchise like another publisher would, right? And so that is good news. But speaking on part 3, I will say at this point, I feel like they're leaning towards part 3. The last we heard is that they have a story outline, and that their next thing, they're obviously working on it, but they're not going to talk about it for a very long time, and that's completely okay. But there is still The Last of Us multiplayer to look forward to, and that should be coming in the short term, I hope. What I can also add here for a tiny news story is, in the same BuzzFeed article, he was also, asked about The Last of Us HBO, a possible season 2, which he did confirm there's conversations. I think that was obvious at this point based on the performance. But he also did reiterate, because I think we've heard this before, but they will not adapt past the games, which I think certainly was a real possibility, or at least it was a rational thought for a lot of folks, is TV is going to move a lot quicker than these games do, so is HBO going to want this thing to go past the games? And he's saying that they're not going to do that, which I think is the right call. All right, moving on to the rumored detachable disk drive PS5 model coming sometime later this year. This is again coming from Tom Henderson, owner of InsiderGaming.com, but this time providing a small update on Twitter where he says, and I quote here, "On all the PS5 Pro Slim rumors, I don't think it's a Pro or a Slim. My understanding is that it's just a Gen 2 of the regular PS5. The normal PS5 will cease production at the end of this year, and the new model will start in April and begin selling in September." In a follow-up tweet, he says, near the end of it, he says, "All I can say is that I've heard more about the PS6 than a PS5 Pro." Yup, absolutely, that tracks. It's something where I don't want to sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but every time the notion of PS5 Pro comes up, I often like to, put this out there that, hey, PS5 Pro, probably not going to happen. It's not viable during this generation where we're on year 3 of PS5. The console saw a price increase. That's still in effect in most markets. So the console market is different, right? You can't offer something that's even more expensive than the current console, right? That, and you take away from what a PlayStation 6 is going to do if you have this another half step to the next console. PS4 Pro was a low volume machine. It's not like it was something that everyone was, picking up on a consistent basis. It was certainly more of an upgrade machine for existing owners, so some may argue that that's fine in this situation, and consumers are more aware of spending a lot of money to upgrade their equipment, but I just don't see it happening. I don't think they could reasonably price this thing in a way where it makes sense and it also sits next to PS5 in a way that works. But you don't want to take away from what a PS6 can do when we have diminishing returns. People are still complaining about PS5 and Series X and how they don't feel next gen. So I don't think this cycle is going to have one, or if it does, it's on a very weird... It won't be on the same timeline, let's just put it that way. Maybe it's, 2025 or later, which at that point would be a weird indicator of PS6 maybe being even further out. But anyway, all that makes sense, but going to the sort of Gen 2, it's going to look similar to PS5 kind of thing. I'm glad he clarified this, because that's been the one thing I've been curious on how he's been phrasing this, like what does he know, what has he been hearing, because this would be the year that they actually do a proper redesign of the hardware. And we've seen internally that they have chopped off a lot of weight. They've got a decent amount of room to possibly get the total size and footprint of this console down a bit smaller, and PS5 could use it. So I would say that's a bit disappointing, actually. He calls it a Gen 2, but we've already seen 2 sort of soft model revisions. Now this would be kind of the same thing. I mean, it's a bit significant in that you now have this option of, say, buying a console at $400, and then if you want the disk drive, now you've got one that can retrofit a disk drive. And if that's something that, if that means something to you, then I would say wait if you're in the market for a PS5. But again, if you're If you don't want to wait, then you can buy one now. Just don't buy a digital console because that disc drive is likely not going to be a retrofit for the current digital edition consoles. But we'll have to still keep waiting to see this thing officially. But I thought for sure this would be the year that it sees a proper redesign, but maybe that's not the case. Perhaps that's more of a 2024 thing. Now, moving on to our latest update for the Microsoft ABK deal, a very peculiar situation has transpired where Microsoft has subpoenaed Sony, which they did. They served them on Tuesday, January 17th, and Sony then filed for an extension to what would then be today, Friday, January 27th. And essentially, both companies right now are negotiating on what kind of information Sony would be willing to or even obligated to provide, which would then be in turn used for Microsoft's defense, the very defense they're building against the FTC. So I guess one way to phrase this would be that Microsoft is looking to, not, it's indirect, right? They're looking for help, but Sony's of course not going to want to do that. So I'm sure the negotiations and what Sony's going to provide, I mean, they're going to try and do something in a way where they don't want to give up information, say as little as possible, because they're going to use Sony's own internal documents to Microsoft's benefit. They're going to approach the FTC and try to go through this administrative process, which, again, it's the FTC's process, it's not a federal case just yet, but they want to smooth it over with the FTC before it has to get to that, which would be the easiest path for Microsoft. But considering the FTC has spent a lot of time on prior mergers, and specifically this one, to kind of use them as a scapegoat of resetting merger rules because they've been very lenient for the past 20 years. I don't think that's going to work out too well for them, but again, Microsoft seems like they're willing to just go through with it either way and then have to deal with the consequences later. But that is our latest update, and a very strange one at that. Now, having said all that, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's so simple. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories that I wanted to talk about with you all from this past week, and our Tuesday video was looking at a brand new PS4 that Sony is still selling in 2023. Why? When was that console manufactured? We dive into that topic about the late life cycle of PS4 and all that. And like I said earlier, the DualSense Edge review will be fairly soon, in a few days. So this weekend, hopefully, and hopefully that also won't impede on Tuesday's upload. It might, so not sure, but follow on Twitter to keep updated on the schedule and uploads and all that. But otherwise, that's it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.